Hello, welcome back. Or if this is your first time joining us, welcome to Manna Financial Freedom. I'm Natasha, financial advisor and coach, and I'm genuinely happy you're here. So you've made it to session 4. And if you've been with me since the beginning, I want you to acknowledge that. You've done the mindset work, you've looked at your budget, faced the debt conversation, which is no small thing, and you're building something real here. And today is the session I think a lot of us have been waiting for. Because today we're talking about saving and investing. We're talking about making your money work for you, not just earning it and watching it disappear. Now, I know investing can feel like a word that belongs to other people. People already have loads of money. People who work in the city, not people like us. But I want to challenge that today because the Bible has always talked about stewardships, multiplication, and legacy. And that's exactly what saving and investing is about. We're going to look at the difference between saving and investing, how interest works, compound versus simple interest, what risk and reward really means, touch on ISAs, pensions, emergency funds, and how to set goals that actually mean something. So there's a lot of gold in this session. Let's not waste any more time. Settle in and have your workbook ready, and let's do this. Welcome to our 4th session. We've got one more session after this. This session, I've jam-packed it with quite a few bits that I wanted to cover. And usually I get quite a lot of questions. That's why I'm quite eager to make sure we start on time for this session. I hope you all have had a good week so far and that last week was productive. And you had some time to think about debt management and how you're going to manage that if that is you and you're in that position. But the next 2 sessions are about pulling the second lever. Do you remember the first lever was about cutting down our outgoings, seeing what things we could reduce without reducing the quality of our lives, reducing things so that we can pay debts and make sure we've got an emergency fund. We're going to talk about saving and investing today. I'll just cover off the agenda. We're going to start with just discussing what is saving and investing and what's the difference, because I hear people use those terms all the time and they mix them up. So we're going to clarify what they are. We're going to talk a bit about interest rates and then a bit about investments. We're going to talk about the risk versus reward concept and the reasons that you should save and invest your money and how to set specific savings and or investment goals. We'll always end with action planning, which is where you commit to the action that you're going to take. Because you can go on to 100 different courses, but if you take no action, they have added no value. We want to make sure that you are actually adding value and achieving the value from it. As I said, many people do mix up savings and investments. And I hear people say, oh, yeah, I'm invested here. And then I look at their account and it's a savings account. Or I've got a savings account and it's actually an investment. So I'm just going to clarify the difference between the two. Some of the key differences are that savings tend to be cash-based and they are short-term. So what do I mean by cash-based? They ultimately have an interest rate. They are usually easy access. Sometimes they're fixed for a certain amount of term, but they can still be accessed. They are very low risk. Your capital is usually guaranteed. So what you put in, you're guaranteed to get back. But their returns are lower when you compare them to other investments. In contrast, investments tend to be or should be looked at medium to long term. They contain assets such as shares, property, bonds, and commodities. They have an element of risk, which ranges from low to high. They can be volatile, but they offer greater returns than savings. Now, what is one of the key things that you will spot determining which one is which is savings will always have an interest rate. Investments do not have an interest rate. If you go to the bank and you're asking for a savings account, they will be able to give you an interest rate. If, however, you're looking for an investment, don't then ask them what is the interest rate, because investments don't have interest rates. Okay, let's just talk a little bit about interest rates. There are 2 types of interest rates, or 2 ways that we use them. One is called APR, which is the annual percentage rate. That's what it stands for. And this gives you an indication of what you will pay if you borrow money. So you'll see APR will refer to debts like credit cards or loans versus AER, which is annual equivalent rate, which is used to calculate the interest on savings accounts. So they're both interest rates, but they just use different terminologies. One's for debt and one is for savings. In terms of interest rates, there are two structures or two ways they calculate your interest rate. For example, if you imagine you've got £10,000 in a savings account with a 5% interest rate, if you were paid simple interest, that would mean that you would earn £500 in the first year. And in the second year, you would earn £500 also. In the same scenario, compound interest, in the first year, you would be paid £500. But in the second year, because you get interest on top of the interest you've already earned, you will earn £525 and so on. By the third year, your 10,000 would have grown to £11,025. Compound interest pays higher, and that's really what you want. Now, it is the preferred structure and it's most common nowadays, to be fair. However, it is really important to look at this. I had a client the other day come in and speak to me. They were paying a certain amount every month into the regular savings account. And the regular savings account has a headline rate, and it's usually higher than the average. Let's just call it 8%, for example. And then you had a savings account, let's say that was paying 4%. You would be quite eager to do the regular savings account. Well, a lot of the regular savings accounts are simple interest. They also cap how much you can pay in. So when you work out the actual pounds and pence that you get, even though that headline rate sounds really good, actually you'd probably be better off over the long run in a lower savings account where you could pay more into it. So just be aware that there are two ways that interest is paid. Regular savings accounts do tend to have simple interest. So that's a real example of where the headline rate isn't the only thing that you should look at when looking at a savings account, or even just calculate it. If you're saving £250 a month and it's paying 10%, then work out how much is that across a year, and then work it out in an alternative account where you might be able to put a lump sum from the very beginning, and then you will see the difference there, or you can ask the bank to confirm it for you. Let's look at investments. So unlike savings, they do not have an interest rate. So remember, I said that at the beginning because I always hear people say, I want an investment, but what interest rate does it pay? Investments do not pay interest rates. They have different levels of risk, and they range from very low risk to very high risk. So some of the more common investments that you will be familiar with are property, shares, bonds, or otherwise known as fixed interest securities, commodities, which are things like oil, gas, corn, sugar, and of course your savings accounts, which we refer to as cash. So if you hear me say cash savings, that's what I'm referring to. And remember, savings have interest rates, but they also form part of the investment world, if you like, because they give you that sort of security. If you have an investment with a company, generally you'll have something in these areas. Sometimes you may have something in only one or two areas, sometimes all of them. It just depends on the makeup of your investment. These types of investments that I'm going to explain more about are what is known as regulated investments. So in the UK, they can only be provided on a self-select basis or via a financial advisor who is regulated. There are now lots of platforms like Trading 212 and Hargreaves Lansdown that let you invest yourself, and we'll talk about that in a second. But that then the onus is on you to obviously make those investment
Can you just
decisions.
let
So
the
you need
phone
to be
silent, please?
comfortable with that investment. So why would I invest? It's generally for capital that you're putting away for 5 years plus. Now, because of the complexity of investments, I cannot go into too much detail about investing because I'm a regulated advisor and there are certain procedures that I need to follow. Everything that I'm giving you today is not advice, it is information just to help you understand investments in a bit more detail, but you will need to do some more of your own homework. As we talked about, investments are higher risk than savings, cash deposits. And that's because when you put your money in a savings account, that money will be safe, or the capital you've paid in, even if the interest rate varies. So your principal investment will normally be fine, it's guaranteed, you won't get less. So this pyramid basically shows you the different risk variations. And you will notice that the bottom, I just get my pointer, you've got bank accounts here, cash equivalents, money market, which is effectively cash as well. So those are all at the bottom, at the base of this risk pyramid, if you like. And then at the top, you've got things like options, futures, and collectibles. What would also be there is any sort of cryptocurrency. That would be in the summit, just to put it in perspective. And then the investments that I'm going to talk about today would normally be in somewhere in this middle region. We're not going to talk about cryptocurrency. They're not regulated currently and they're not something that I give advice on, but it's just key to note that they are towards the top of the risk summit. Generally, the higher the risk, the higher the reward, but that isn't always the case. It is critical to note that higher risk also means higher volatility. That is why it's called higher risk. So in my newsletter that I wrote a couple of weeks ago, I did talk about the fact that people really should go into investing with their eyes open. If you cannot afford to take the risk, you shouldn't be taking it. Don't listen to whoever, told you this is a good investment, especially if they're not qualified, because you have to be comfortable to actually have the downturns as well as the upturns. And in some cases, you could lose all of your money. So high risk is really for somebody that knows what they're doing and you're comfortable to do that. So I've talked about investments and maybe scared some of you with the risk levels, but let's talk about why someone would invest. Like, why would you even put money in an investment at all? This graph has already happened. This is factual. And this shows somebody who invested over 35 years. They contributed £377,760 into an ISA. And what it does is it compares if they had left it in a savings account versus putting it in an investment. So if you had left it in a savings account, you would probably get back, based on the money market movements, which is interest rates effectively, about £591,386. Some of us will say, I'm happy with that. That's loads of money, more than I could dream of. However, if you had invested that with all its ups and downs, because you can clearly see it's not a straight line, you would get back £1,370,224. Clearly a lot better. However, this person would need to be happy to accept these highs and these lows, because that is part and parcel of investing. And that's why we always say you should be in it for the long run, because there's absolutely no one on this earth that can tell you how an investment is going to perform. We can assume, but we cannot guarantee. There's no investment that's going to be guaranteed unless it's fixed type investment. So whilst it's amazing to point out that the share lines moved up and down, it is important that you are comfortable with that level of volatility. I say when you invest, don't be checking it every day. That's the worst thing to do. You need to put it away and forget about it. Past performance is also not a guide to future. You've probably heard that before. It is one of the disclaimers that the Financial Conduct Authority advisors to always mention, especially if we look at past performance, because it doesn't mean that's going to happen in the future. Nothing is guaranteed ultimately. And a lot of the time when, as advisors, we look at investments, we look at past performance because that's all we have. We can assume what's going to happen in the future, but there is no financial expert that can tell you this is guaranteed to happen in the investment market. But the good news is when you are looking at investments, there are things that you can do to lessen the risk a bit. How you get started for those new to investing. As I said, I won't be giving any specific advice. This is just broad information. Before making your investment decisions, I would normally say start looking at a fund, which is a name that you'll hear bandied around if you start to talk about investments. Why funds? Because they're simple and they are an effective starting point. If you start by trading, you really do need to know what you're doing. And what the difference is, trading is buying individual shares in a particular company. If that company went bankrupt or something happened, you will lose all of your money in that share. When you invest in one company, you carry a higher risk. But what a fund does, which is basically what you're looking on this screen, this is an example of a fund. There are all different types of funds, like thousands, but it spreads the money that you invest into different assets. So you might have some in shares, some in bonds. You'll also have some in different parts of the world as well. You might have some in property, some in cash. And effectively, this is what's called a diversified fund. So it means that your eggs are not in one basket. And there is a scripture about that in Proverbs. So for each fund, you will have at least one fund manager, which means that you don't have to worry about it. You just pick your fund and they do all the work. Their job is to manage it and make profit, and they're managed accordingly for that. And of course, they charge for that. The beauty of a fund is it means that if you don't understand investments and you're new to it and you just want to put some money away, whether it's on a regular basis or a lump sum, you can still benefit from the investment market, but somebody's doing the work for you. You're not having to decide, do I invest in this company or that company? And should I change depending on what's happening in the economy? It's all done for you. So you don't need to understand each asset. I'm only explaining it so that you have the information, but the good thing is you don't need to understand it. There's always a flavor of the month that people say, oh, you invest in gold. But what you will find is that those people will definitely not be people who are au fait with the financial market, because when people tell you to invest, usually it means it's at its peak. It means it's done well. And the key to investing is you want to get it at the bottom, not at the top. So gold often does very well when equities decline or it's volatile, because it's a safe haven. So you'll see people invest in gold in that time. When you're in a fund, you don't need to make those decisions. The fund manager will do it, and they'll invest in whatever is the right thing to do at the time, and they'll be managed according to that. You can do investing through an advisor. Generally, you will find financial advisors will not give advice if you don't have a lump sum of 50,000 because of their fees. Then you would use an online self-service platform. So say you wanted to get started with, say, £25 a month. Most banks have a great platform and they also have information on there, but there's other platforms like Hargreaves Lansdown who are quite good, Vanguard, Interactive Investor. I would definitely encourage you, if you've got money that you want to put away for 5 years plus, do it in an investment. Or if you're saving for children, that's another good reason to do it. And I'll show you why as well. Now, in terms of risk levels, if you do invest through a financial advisor, we would normally go through what is known as a risk tolerance questionnaire. But if you're doing the self-service, it would normally guide you. They'll say, this is a medium risk, this is a high risk, this is a low risk, and so on. So you can get quite good support without needing an advisor, especially if you're starting off. If you have a larger amount, I would strongly recommend that you do see a financial advisor, because you're investing a large amount, so you probably want to spread your eggs a bit further afield. Remember, investments should only be considered for the long term, okay, not for the short term. So far, we've talked a lot about the facts, and we haven't really talked about what does the Bible say. We've talked about the difference between savings and investments, but why should you have those as the body of Christ? And there's many theories and conversations about money in the body of Christ. And you'll remember we've talked about the importance of being a good steward. And your wealth is no different. And there's even two parables in the New Testament, in Luke and in Matthew, that shows us an example of this. I don't think it could become clearer. It came from Jesus's own mouth, the parable of the talent and the parable of the minas, and that is really clear. As a matter of fact, the servant that was the poor steward was cursed, and his talent and mina was taken away from him. And in Psalms 24, verse 1, David confirms that the earth is the Lord's and all its fullness. Paul later again reconfirms again that the earth is the Lord and all its fullness. And many times we read this scripture in agreement, but we never really grasp what this meant. See, I understand the earth was the Lord's. However, when it came to money, I never used to associate this with the earth and its fullness. However, if you understand the history of money, which I will go through with you, you start to really understand that everything we have is the Lord's. We are only stewards. Nothing is ours. Not only does it belong to Him, but He tells us how we should use our wealth and resources. I know we all know the history of creation, and in Genesis 1, we have a full explanation of creation as demonstrated here. And John 1, verse 3 confirms that all things were made through him, and without him, nothing was made that was made. So then let's look at some evidence. In Genesis 2, verse 10 to 12, it states, "Now a river flowed out of Eden to water the garden, and from there it divided and became four branching rivers. The first river is named Pishon. It flows around the entire land of Havilah, where there is gold. The gold of that land is good. Bdellium, a fragrant, valuable resin, and onyx stone are found there. And gold is often used to demonstrate a country's wealth. It's one of the oldest forms of wealth. It isn't the oldest, and I'll show you that in a second, but it's one of the oldest forms of wealth. And God created it. So man did not create money. We use gold as money, and we did use it for many years. Obviously, it became very heavy, and we have advanced since then. But God placed gold in the Garden of Eden. So money doesn't belong to us. Our job is to be stewards of it. So let's look at the evolution of money. The scripture tells us that the Lord created the animals, gold, precious metals, the herbs, the trees, water, and so on. But money, there is a very clear pathway of the development money. So in Abraham's days, there would have been like a barter system. And you'll notice in the Bible, it talks about him being really rich in cattle and, sheep and all of those animals. So resources such as animals were used to barter with. Now you can imagine you can't really put an animal in your pockets. We've developed since then, but that was how things were determined in terms of wealth. We also see an example of this with Solomon when building the Lord's temple, and he asked the king of Tyre to send him resources and workers, and he in turn agreed to send wheat, barley, oil, and wine. This is known as bartering or trading. It was very common. That was the beginning of money or equivalent of money. But then gold came in, which was the currency, and gold still is used in some instances. It is very much determined how wealthy a country is by its gold that it holds. And we know gold was in the Garden of Eden. And in fact, to show you how amazing God is, I investigated how gold is made. And gold is made by a naturally occurring element that is formed over, it's believed, millions of years. So we don't know how old the world is, but it takes millions of years to form gold. In fact, if you want to know one of the reasons for volcanic eruptions, well, this brings the gold to the surface. The gold already exists. We didn't create it. It was already there. It's just that when you have volcanic eruptions, it brings the gold to the surface. So God built everything for a purpose. And once I understood that gold existed before we were created, it's also clear that gold is not grown by humans. And you can do this research. Actually, they have tried, as they've tried with most things, scientists that have tried to create gold and have been somewhat successful, they have been known to state that creating gold through nuclear reactions is not practical or cost effective. In other words, it costs more than the gold is worth. So it's not something that they would be doing very often. And later we had metal coins, which were made from gold, silver, and bronze. And then paper money was developed as coins became very heavy to carry around. I don't know if you've seen some of them old movies and they have these bags of coins. And then we've got plastic cards, which we use now, and electronic money, and then more recently, cryptocurrency. All of these currencies stem from the resources provided by God. So if you ever need proof that your money is the Lord's, then here's the proof. As I started to investigate this and understood that my resources weren't mine. I had a new appreciation for my resources, and it became so much more important for me to be a good steward because I realized that everything I owned was the Lord. And when you're in charge of something, you view it very differently rather than thinking it's yours. Why should we invest or save even? Because I'm not here to push either one. Ultimately, it's like I said, it depends on how long you're saving for. And I'll show you examples of when you would use that. But the scripture is very clear on what we should do with our wealth. So the one of the things it talks about is being able to bless and serve each other. And Proverbs 11, verse 24 to 25, Luke 6, verse 38, and Proverbs 22, verse 9. You can write the scriptures down, talk about us being able to bless and serve each other. Secondly, preparing for emergencies. There's two proverbs that talks about that, but also I'm sure we can all think of emergencies that have occurred. So do look at the Proverbs 6, verse 6 to 8, and Proverbs 10, verse 4 to 5. And then to plan for future events and purpose. Genesis 41, verse 35 to 36. Last but not least, the Bible talks about passing on an inheritance. If you ever think about wealth in families, that's what happens. Having things to pass on to family, not just money, but also knowledge, and all of those things are important. And that's talked about in Proverbs 13, verse 22, and Ecclesiastes 7, verse 11. Using our wealth according to God's purpose is important. However, if your priority is debt repayment, I understand that it may not be possible to set a savings or long-term investment goal right away, but I want you to do it when you can. Once you have repaid your debt, then do definitely concentrate on building up some nest egg for yourself. However, there is something that everyone should be doing irrelevant of your financial position. If you are repaying debt, you should also be putting something in an emergency pot because otherwise it will be counterproductive. You'll pay off the debt, an emergency will arise while you're paying it off, and you'll have to use it again. So you should be doing the two at the same time. An emergency fund is for everyone. No one is exempt from that. We've talked about the fact that debt repayment might make it a little difficult for you to save long term, depending on your financial position. But I do want everyone to work towards that. So, one of the reasons that saving and investing is so important is something called inflation. Inflation is the increase in goods and services. And I'm sure all of us have been to the supermarket. I'm flabbergasted every time I go how little I walk out with and how much it costs. And it really has increased post-Brexit. But here's an example of two things that are quite common in most households and how they've changed over the years. Let's look at bread. In 1968, a loaf of bread was 8p. In 1990, it was 50p. And in 2020, it was £1.07. In 24, it was £1.40. Considerably increased from 1968. So if your money doesn't increase with the cost of living, then actually it's decreasing. And then let's look at a pint of milk. I haven't gone back as far, but from 1990, it was 25p. 2020, it was 42p, and 2024, 55p. So if we recognize these are just two items, and there's some that have probably got bigger margins than this, if things are going up in price and your money isn't, then it's losing what we call your spending power. That means that your money is actually losing value, even though it's still £10, but the amount it can buy is a lot less. And that is why it is so important for your money to work hard for you. When I wrote this course, the inflation was somewhere around 3.8. It's a bit lower now, but not much lower. And that means in order for your money to keep up with inflation, just keep up with inflation, it needs to earn 3.8 or more percent in the account that it's held in. Most savings accounts are not paying that at the moment. If you have any money that's sitting down and you want to be a good steward, you should be looking to at least beat 3.8% as an interest rate. Or if it's an investment, then the chances are you would get a higher return than that over the long run. Now we come on to a bit of homework. We've talked about emergency funds. And Emergency funds are so important. It's one of the things that will stop you having to borrow. And even just recently, someone was telling me they live in a converted house, and with all this rain, they've had a leak. And luckily, they did have an emergency fund. But if they hadn't, they would have had to borrow. So an emergency fund, it just avoids you having to borrow because it's an emergency. It's going to need addressing. So I would encourage you to look at your budget planners that you've already completed and look at how much that you can save towards an emergency fund. Now, people always ask me, how much should I have? The official answer is you should have 3 to 6 months outgoings. But if you're starting from zero, then clearly that's quite a large jump. However, just build up what you can, is what I would say. Something is better than nothing. Once you start to build it up, you can then work towards a target. The reason that it's 3 to 6 months, especially for self-employed, because if you were unable to earn for whatever period, at least you know you could pay your mandatory bills. So that's where that figure comes from, and it buys you some time, whether that's 3 months or 6 months or anywhere in between. And also, don't forget things like redundancy, companies folding or whatever. It just gives you some breathing space. An emergency fund is something that everybody should have and everybody should be working to. I want you to revisit your budget planner, your spending diary, and consider how much can you realistically save for emergencies. I don't care if it's £10 a month, that's still 120 a year. Something is better than nothing. The key is to have something for emergencies to avoid having to borrow. Then I want you to open a savings account with a competitive interest rate that offers instant access to your money or easy access, because remember, this is for emergencies. You can't put it away and then can't access it when an emergency happens. I would keep it separate from your normal spending. Some people even have it in a different bank because it's out of sight, out of mind. If you know that's better for you, then open it with a different bank so that when you go on your online banking, you don't naturally see that account and think, oh, yeah, I could use that. It should be for emergencies only. Once you've got the amount that you can save, please automate it. Save via a standing order, an automatic transfer. So as you get paid, it just puts that amount that you've agreed you can afford into that account so you can forget about it. Don't obviously do it on the exact day you're paid, just in case anything goes wrong, but maybe the day after or 2 days after, but very close to you getting paid. And that way you would do it without noticing. Another trick as well is if you get pay rises. Let's just say you get a pay rise of £20 a month, not a massive amount, probably not going to change your world, but what about putting that £20 into your emergency fund? So you're almost on the same pay you've always been anyway. You wouldn't even miss it. That's another good time. I know pay rises tend to come around April time. If that's you and you don't feel you could do it yet, then plan for April and put that away. So what sort of pots should I have, or do I have? So your short term would be your 1 to 4 years, and that's your emergency fund and maybe money that you're planning to spend in the short term, less than 5 years. Then you've got medium term, which I call pot of blessings. That's 5 to 10 years. And you can put things like your money that you want to be able to bless someone with at whatever point in the future. It could be planned expenditure further down the line if you're not doing it before 5 years. And you could put this in either fixed term savings, so you can get some fixed term accounts that, will give you a fixed interest for a certain amount of years, or investments, depending on what you're saving for. And then your long term, which is 10 years plus, would be things that you want to give to the children. Maybe they're really young, or grandchildren, inheritance, and also old age, which we are going to talk about pensions because we can't forget about those. But before we do that, I just want to cover off something that I'm always asked about, which is one particular type of account in which you could use in all of these pots. And that is an ISA. So one of the most common questions I get asked is, what is an ISA? I hear that bandied around. What does it mean? So an ISA stands for individual savings account. It's a special UK savings or investment that lets you grow your money without paying tax on the interest or the returns. So if you think of it like a wrapper, a protective wrapper that keeps the tax man off your savings. If you've got any amount of savings, then you more than likely know that you'll be paying some tax on that. So why do ISAs matter? Because they help your money grow faster because you don't have to worry about paying tax. You keep 100% of the interest, not give some to the tax man. When you sell them or cash them in or draw money out, there's no tax on those as well. And they're quite flexible and they help you to build wealth in a tax efficient way. And the other tax efficient way that complements an ISA is a pension, which we'll talk about in a second. So there are many different types of ISAs, but they generally fall into two categories. The first one is a cash ISA. And you'll remember at the beginning of the session, we talked about savings versus investments. Cash ISA comes under savings. It will have an interest rate versus an investment ISA, or otherwise known as a stocks and shares ISA. And that won't have an interest rate because it will be invested. So we've got loads of different ISAs, they come and go, but ultimately they fall into those two categories. Now, the main difference between the different ISAs is how much you can pay into them and the terms and conditions of the accounts. But ultimately, they are tax-free accounts. I have heard people say it's not worth having an ISA, and that's not officially true because an ISA is tax-free. So it absolutely is worth it. And the more you save into it, the more worth it is. So there are many people who have hundreds of thousands of pounds in ISAs. And had they had that outside of an ISA, they would have a significant tax bill. So definitely ISAs are worth looking at when you're looking at savings. So in your workbooks, you have got some trackers. You've got a set of savings trackers and you've got a set of investment trackers. The savings trackers, you've got short term, which is your emergency fund, and then the medium term, which is your planned expenditure or your pot of blessings or whatever you're going to use that for. I've just shown you an example on the screen of how you would complete it. And what it does, using the importance of writing things down, it allows you to document what you're saving. It's very simple. You document what goes in and what goes out. This one on the screen is an emergency fund example, and this person's paying money in, and then you can see the out, and they've written it was a car repair. And then they'll continue building that back up, which is a manual way of you keeping track of your accounts. And in terms of filling them in, they're quite self-explanatory, but there is an example in the workbook at the back. So in addition to your savings trackers, you've also got investment trackers. So these are slightly different because you'll notice I use the word fund. So you can write the name of the fund. If you're using a self-service platform and you've chosen a fund, it helps to remind what fund you've chosen. And ultimately, you're going to do the same. You're going to keep a track of what you've paid in and what you pay out so that you understand how your assets are growing, how you are creating wealth for yourself, especially in the medium and the long term. You wouldn't believe how many clients I meet who have been, some of them really good investors, but cannot tell me where their money is. I think I've got something there, and I think I've got something there, and I think I've got something there. It's a way of you keeping track of those things, no matter how small or big they are, in one place. So do use your trackers, and also it will help you to know if one's not doing so well. What if the balance was X this year and then you reviewed it in 6 months' time and it's actually not doing so well, and then you reviewed it in a year and it's not doing so well? You might want to think about whether that's the right investment for you. But if you're not keeping abreast of it, you wouldn't know that's the case. I said that I would talk to you a bit about pensions, and I was hoping I would have enough time, and it looks like I have. I'm going to do this quite quickly, but it's really important because it's relative to everybody. So where do pensions fit in? Pensions are your long term. They're 5 years plus, and usually longer than that. And why are they important? I remember when I was younger, and I was talking to a colleague who was also young, and we were talking about pensions, and I was talking to him about, what I was putting in my pension. And he was like, "What's the point? You're young. Why are you thinking about a pension?" And I guarantee you, if I spoke to him again, he would have a different view because we're all going to get older. That's a fact. So what I've got here is just the average lifespan based on the statistics. And how long of your years do you spend on average in retirement? For females, it's 23 years, and for men, it's 20 years. That's a long time. If you don't plan those years, then that could be quite a miserable time, or it could be a lovely time. I would definitely encourage you to make sure that you are paying into a pension and thinking about your pension. And I'm going to show you something that you can use just to start to think about how you plan your pension. The other thing as well is if you're close to retirement, you should be starting to tidy things up, especially if you've got pots here, there, and everywhere. Start to think about whether or not you can retire at the age you want to retire. Even though it's got 20 to 23 years here, some people spend 30 years in retirement. It can be a really long time. My question to you, and this is when you know whether you should be thinking about your pensions, is how much do you need if you were to retire today? That's the first question. And if you can answer that realistically, not pie in the sky, just an amazing figure that you pick out of the sky, but if you can, then tell me how close are you to achieving that? The truth is most people can't answer that question. So you're not alone. But the fact that you can't answer that question means that you do need to pay attention. Remember, we've talked about inflation and the increase of cost of things. And if you're not thinking about your future, especially if you want to retire early and you're younger, then it will come closer and you've done nothing about it. Unfortunately, I do also I see people who have done really well and I see people who haven't. And the people that haven't usually come to me in their 60s and say, what can I do? And there's very little you can do because you haven't thought about it before. You're not too young to think, I had my first pension when I was 18, which was the youngest you could have it. You should be paying into a pension. There's loads of advantages to doing that as well. But let's talk about the state pension because I think this is one of the major problems why it's so important to have your own pension. So in the UK, we use something called a pay-as-you-go system. So what that means is today's workers are what pays for today's retired people. So although we all pay national insurance, you're not like paying national insurance for your future. You're paying those that are retired. Okay. The statistics tell us that people are living longer and spending a lot longer in retirement. That means that there's more need to pay pension payments. If there's more people retired than there is working, then clearly there's going to be an imbalance because there's less money going in and more coming out. And that is what the statistics tell us is happening and is due to get worse, which is why the government are looking at increasing pension ages because the system becomes harder to sustain and the maths just doesn't make sense. So some of the things they're looking at is future pensioners might not receive the same level of support. So the amount you get as pension could be lower or increasing the pension age, which currently is 67, moving to 68 for a lot of people. Now, if you want to know how much you're likely to get from your state pension, the good news, you can get that for free. You can do it online or what is known as a BR19 form that you can complete. And then based on your national insurance, they will send you what pension you might expect from the state and at what age you will expect it. However, if you're really young, just bear in mind that could change. I do encourage everyone to get their state pension forecast. There's no harm in doing it. It just gives you an idea. And also some people haven't paid enough national insurance, especially if you've been a stay-at-home mother and things like that. It might have impacted you. So then you actually understand rather than wait until they write to you closer to the time and you don't have a surprise. And there's things you can do to make up the gap. Pensions at a glance, you have three types of pensions. You have a workplace pension, which if you work, you should have, everyone should have. Personal pension, and then there's the state pension. So we talked about the state pension and the problem with the maths. Less people working, more retired than working. The maths just isn't mathing. The personal pension is your own provision. And then the workplace pension is what work provides. If you have a workplace pension, that's the first step. Maximize that. Usually your employers will match it. So you really want to maximize that before you think about any personal provision. Use your works pension first. But there's something that I do want to talk to you about before we summarize today. And that is how to know if you're on track. There's a site called Money Helper, which is a government-backed website, and it provides lots of guidance on it. But one of the things they have is a pension calculator. I'm going to put a guide in today's handouts that will talk you through how to use it. And it will help you calculate whether you're on track to achieve the retirement that you want. Money Helper will not offer financial advice. It isn't there for that. It's just to give you the facts, but the calculator is really useful. If you have a number of pensions that you haven't reviewed and you want to consolidate them, you can, of course, reach out to me. More than happy to guide you, depending on their size. I'll tell you the best route to look at with that. But the key is to find out whether you're in track. I don't care if you're 20 or you're 55. Because some of the common mistakes I come across are thinking I'll start later. When you're missing the compounding years, remember we talked about compounding interest, compounding investments works exactly the same. Relying on a state pension is not a good idea, and ignoring pension statements, loads of people do that, or keeping your contributions too low for too long. And also, one of the common ones I see is people don't review the pension performance. Is it performing? It shouldn't be the same this year as it was last year and 5 years ago. Has it gone up or has it gone down? These are really important questions that you should be considering. I really do encourage you, use the pension calculator, and you literally just click on start pension calculator. But as I say, I'm going to put the guide in how to do it, and just find out how close you are to having the retirement that you want. And if you're not, then the good news is you can do something about it, and you can use your budget planner to work out what you can afford to do about it. As I said, with every session, we are going to utilize our action plan. And our action plan will depend on the goals that we've chosen. But based on today's session, remember I said these are working documents. You may realize that actually, do you know what? I do need an emergency fund, but I also need to think about my retirement because I'm only 10 years away, or 15 years away, or 5 years away, whatever that looks like. Or I'm really young, just started working, but actually I didn't think much about a pension. So maybe I need to do that as a goal in terms of work out what sort of pension do I need. I'm going to ask you to complete your action plan with the actions that, if there are any, that came from today's session. It could be, I want to start to build wealth. I want to get into investing, and I'll just start with £50 a month and it's affordable. I've repaid my debts already, or I don't have debts. This is really the bit that I want to concentrate on. Whatever the case may be, just take action. In summary, we talked about Jesus's teachings on saving and investing, as well as the biblical principles from David, Solomon, and we even went back to God's creation. And as always, I do encourage you to study the scriptures and seek God and understand his personal instruction to you. But ultimately, what Jesus told us is it's sin for us to put something in an account and just not take any notice of it and it not be growing or multiplying. So we explored how savings and investments work. And as I said, you go with what you're comfortable with, and the importance of having an emergency fund and not worrying about, oh, I've only got £10. £10 still matters. Jesus said, consider the ant. So actually, every little adds up. So as a reminder for your homework tasks, I want you to again go back to your budget planner and spending diary. Consider how much you can realistically save for emergencies. The key is to have something to avoid having to borrow. Open a savings account that has a competitive rate, and then automate it. Pay that money in automatically into that savings account, even if it's with another bank. If you've got a larger disposable income, then great. You might want to use the different pots. You might already have an emergency fund. Then your goal might be, I need to think about my long-term wealth creation, building up some wealth for the future. And whatever that looks like and the reason for that. Don't forget to keep records of your pots. And if this isn't possible at the moment, please don't worry, because I do believe as we improve, we'll all become better stewards, and you will find you'll have additional resources, but you would have learnt the skills to being a good steward. This isn't a race. I said it last week with the debt. Some people, it may take longer. That's absolutely fine. The key is to start the change. And I will say, as I've said in this session a few times, start with building an emergency fund. No matter how small, something is better than nothing. That's the end of today's session. Next week is the final session. We're going to also explore ways we can pull the second lever and increase what's coming in. I hope to see all of you next week. But something that I encourage you to do is to study for yourselves. And a good place to start is if you want to understand Jesus's words. It's the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, where Jesus talks about the kingdom principles and the ones that I've included in this course. And then if you want to think about Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, which is from the richest and wisest man to ever live. And fun fact, actually, did you know that according to First Chronicles 29, verse 3 to 4, David left Solomon when he died 3,000 talents of gold, 7,000 talents of silver, among other precious stones and metals. This would equate to 7,185,000,000. However, Solomon's wealth was estimated in today's terms to be 2.1 trillion, based on that income he received every year, assuming he continued to receive it. So to put that into perspective, he would be richer than Elon Musk, roughly by 8 times. When it comes to stewardship, this is why I pay attention to Solomon, someone who has wisdom, but also someone who demonstrated good stewardship with his wealth. He might have gone wrong in a few other areas, but in terms of his wealth, he was a good steward, and he did a lot of things that I would pay attention to. And then, of course, the Acts and onwards, which talks about how we should operate as a new church with each other. And that talks about serving each other. And that's why wealth is important. It isn't all about storing up for myself, but actually, if my brother or sister need help, can I help them? It's having that ability to be able to give back and not block the chain, as we are one body ultimately. So do have a read through these scriptures. I would encourage you with your wealth goggles on, if you like. And I think you'll find that really inspiring. So thank you all for today.
With that, just want to say thank you. May the Lord bless each and every one of you as you go through the week and begin this part of your journey. And don't forget what Martin Luther King said. You don't have to see the whole staircase. You just take the first step. And it's that first step. Okay, everybody, thank you very much. And we'll see you next week for the last one. May the Lord bless you. Amen.
And that, my friend, is session 4. Done. Look at you. I genuinely hope that something shifted for you today, whether it was understanding compound interest for the first time, realizing that you can start investing even with small amounts, or just making peace with the idea that building wealth is not greedy, it is wise stewardship. God wants you to multiply what he's given you. That is a kingdom principle. I want you to take a moment to celebrate how far you've come. 4 sessions in, you've covered budgeting, spending, debt, and now saving and investing. You can't be the same person who clicked on session 1, and that definitely is worth celebrating. Getting that emergency fund started, opening that savings account, starting up that standing order, these are the small actions that will have a big impact. And for those of you who are ready to go further, start thinking about your investment goals and your pension too. Future you will be so grateful. Now, can I ask a small favor? If this course has been valuable to you, please like this video. It costs you nothing and it genuinely helps others find this content. Leave a comment, tell me what you're going to do differently after today, or share your biggest aha moment. I love hearing from you. And if you haven't already, please subscribe, turn on notifications so you don't miss the next session or any other sessions that we'll have in the future. We still have more to cover and I cannot wait to keep walking this journey with you. Until next time, God bless you, keep going, and remember, wealth on purpose starts with you. Bye for now.